So I grew up around electronics, and my first piece of software was written on paper tape to keep those companies I was talking about alive. The smaller companies, the lifeblood of the systems. Why aren't we able to stop? Why do we keep accelerating? And that was the beginning of a new path for me, and a realization that technology can't fix that.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast.
Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Barry James, a transformation architect, Changemaker, author, and overall systems thinker. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Great to be here, Dustin. PolyInnovator. Wow. Love it.
That's the word I chose to be kind of my multidisciplinary term. I felt polymath was a little bit dated, and I wanted to find a way to explain who I was to the world. And so I came up with that polymath of innovation idea. I figured it worked. Yeah,
it's great. It feels like my world. Let's go.
Well, the way I like to break the ice is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Yeah. Something that I keep discovering things about my past that no one knows, or I've completely forgotten. I just realized when I was looking at a post yesterday talking about the history of computing, it's going to make me sound really old, but I grew up around valves because my dad was a TV engineer. And a union convener. Not many people know that either. So I've had more electric shocks than electric eel, I think, or anyone around an electric eel. When I was toddling around the house when I was small, upwards. So I grew up around electronics, and my first piece of software was written on paper tape. So I've kind of been through the valve generation, the discrete transistor generation, the discrete, and then the integrated silicon revolution. Even before we got to the PC revolution, the internet revolution, the blockchain revolution, and now the AI revolution. So I don't know many people that can, have personal experience of all those. That wasn't really the answer to your question, but I think involved it somewhere.
I think that question is really pretty free-form. People might think of it like, oh, I just want an answer. It's very simple. No, I ask it because it gets you thinking. And then basically, if you can think of an answer for that question, every other question after that's going to be a lot easier, I feel like. And that's why I ask it first.
Yeah, I pick out of that the fact that, and I don't know why I've, downplayed this or rarely mentioned it, but my as I say, my dad was a union convener, and that was a big part of his life.
Well, and you got to see the evolution of technology from a unique perspective. My grandma was using computers in I think the late 80s and early 90s, which is pretty early, especially for her generation. But you're talking about even earlier than that, and seeing the actual changes and evolutions in the technology as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of living with it, and in some cases, certainly in med tech in the UK, and then later in fintech in the UK, being to some extent an innovator myself, and innovating in the ecosystem.
And I've talked to some doctors in the UK on the show, and they were talking about how, given the healthcare system, a lot of technology is a little bit behind, a little bit dated, because they don't have the funding to buy the new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, my involvement goes back pre-internet, any of that, and I came, in at the point when the NHS was beginning to work on getting PCs, and so on into GP surgeries and places like that. And I was involved at that stage, and we ended up creating. You call it medtech now, but systems, early communications between pathology labs and GP surgeries and so on that were 10, in some cases 15 or more years ahead of the kind of official, version. And Monarchit, a system across the city here in Sheffield, the first in Europe. We had the GPs communicating email and other things with the pathology labs and the hospitals and so on. Literally a mini busload of experts descended from London to tell us that this is not supposed to work. You're not supposed to be able to do this. Well, look, it's actually happening, which is even more fun in hindsight, really.
Well, speaking of hindsight and some of your past here, what was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then?
It's changed radically, and COVID played a role in that. So most of my career and life has been in technology, usually at a very carefully titrated space from the leading edge. I love to play with technologies at the point when they're ready, but we apply them in different ways than are being applied at the time, and help them to kind of proliferate. Very much what we did with MedTech, very much what I'm kind of doing in another way for a different reason now. But the difference is that there came a point in COVID when, I brought together some humanitarian teams, task forces, to tackle some of the major problems to keep people alive and businesses alive as well.
Right.
Which was completely scuppered. We'd done a huge amount of work very swiftly with some key fintech players to get money to keep those companies I was talking about alive. The smaller companies, the lifeblood of the systems, and the rug was just unceremoniously pulled for basically greed and selfish reasons in a humanitarian crisis, and that set me on a new course, Dustin. I'm not a rube. I've been around the block many times. I've seen, the things I could tell you, but this even floored me. The level of, in a national, global calamity, a humanitarian one, banks prepared to behave like that, and it was banks, and that got me thinking, and it got me asking some key questions. Why are we wrecking the planet? We know we are. We continue to do it. Why are we now on a track that's impoverishing everyone? Each generation used to be able to be better off than the last, and that's turned around and is headed in the opposite direction. But more importantly, we all kind of know those things. Why aren't we able to stop? Why do we keep accelerating? And that was the beginning of a new path for me, which, and a realization that technology can't fix that. That's about the way you're using technology. It's about culture. It's about the way that we make decisions and the framework we use for making decisions, which led me to start what became the Humane Economics Project. I wrote the book. I will finish and publish it probably one day, but I'm too busy doing the things that came from it. But the book title is why we're all screwed and what we can do about it. But the people who kind of got around and reviewed that with me and worked with me on that said, yeah, that's the important bit. What can we do about it? So, my efforts, my focus now is on the macro and the micro. We'll come back. Maybe we'll come on to the micro and what we're doing at grassroots level later. But at the macro level, how we change our operating system, because it's not changing. For all the efforts that are from Greenpeace and XR and all of the other great work that's being done by Donuts Economics and others, it ain't changing, and we got to find a way to change it.
I think I mentioned to you a while back when we first met this idea that I came up with called the United Living Construct. It was this organization I was trying to make where it was the idea of world unity through self-development, because I figured in order to change the macro, you had to change the individual micro people, or encourage them to change themselves, like make them realize, oh, I want to improve. I want to be a better version of myself. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to there. And that kind of makes me think of this question here. Can you explain the premise behind the Humane X network?
I mean, it came from that work. So Humane Economics was the starting point because it was it became clear to me almost straight away that the driving force between those two polycrisis, if you like, key factors and all of the others as well, was the economic thinking and the economic system that frames our decision making at global level, at national level, regional, local government, and right down into, certainly in corporate businesses and increasingly in other areas as well. It's suffused education, it's suffused health. And so this is the financialization of thinking that we kind of don't know. We don't notice it because it's the water we now swim in. So it was from that has come humane energy, which is, a natural part of that. We have, a situation in the UK here is no different in the US in this regard, that our leaders tell us that, we might be in crisis, particularly last year, because of the level of taxation, if you like, globally, built into the energy prices. But there's nothing we can do about it. We've lost control. It's controlled by the global markets. Well, and no thinking beyond that says, well, why did we do that? Well, it was supposed to give us more flexibility and better prices. And what's it done is become a strategic asset for bad actors, for Putin and so on. So, but then where's the thinking that says, okay, how do we mitigate or change that? Well, there isn't. It's just like, oh, well, that's how it is. It's set by the global markets, right? So, so that's kind of the energy piece at a macro level. It's kind of, there's other elements now coming that are humane, this, humane that, including something called Dignity Donut and so on. So it came to the point where we're going, well, we need an umbrella that has got humane economics in it, humane energy and, other humane, projects, initiatives from the same ethos and source. So Humane X, that's where Humane X as a name came from. The X being, the variable.
I like that whole variable too, because it makes it more of an umbrella at that point, so you can incorporate many different areas into it, not just economics or not just ecology, but many different things.
Yeah.
What got you started on this innovation journey?
Originally, way back when, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Just example, yeah.
I guess, as I say, I grew up in a household where electronics was everywhere. There were TVs being repaired. There were, old radios. My dad used to like to get some of the older radios that no one wanted anymore, valve sets and this sort of thing. A beautiful object in their own right, many of them, and repair them and so on. So it was kind of natural for me to want to tinker with circuits and, trying to understand how that worked and make things happen. So by the time I'd started work, not only, had I been programming actually for about 8 years, I only did the calculation the other day, which was incredibly unusual in those days. I had I'll call it a misunderstanding with my very first boss, who disagreed with the fact that I was recruited as a systems analyst. And there was a well-worn career path in those days that you would become, at most a programmer, maybe a data operator, but then a programmer. And then after a few years, you graduate to become a systems analyst. And she said I was far too young. I couldn't possibly be a systems analyst. And it only dawned on me quite recently, by the way, that actually the person who made the decision and the recruiter had realised what, I only realised in retrospect. I'd already been programming for 8 years. I had the experience. And
probably more than your boss too.
Yeah, absolutely. Way more, as it turns out. But, you kind of, don't necessarily know what you don't know at that point.
Well, and it comes down to marketing too, sorry.
Sorry?
It comes down to marketing yourself as well.
Yeah, to some extent. But the innovation was, and also that's what I was going to say is one of the reasons I was mentioning it. In addition to the programming and all of that, and I produced some commercial software at that point, which was innovative. It's amazing what you could do on a small micro, a BBC micro. You didn't have those in the States. You had Apple, the early Apple machines, but they were kind of, they had a maximum of, I think, 256K of memory. Amazing what you can do with that. But I was also, building circuits and trying different things and trying, I'm interested in the frontier, where it was and how you could, work out what might come next or build what might come next.
It kind of even reminds me of like the Game Boy too. The Game Boy had very little processing power, but a lot of game developers were able to make interesting things come out of it, despite the fact it was underpowered. And by having those technical limitations, it kind of induces that creativity.
Yeah. I actually produced a system on the BBC Micro in that frame that could produce sheet music, play the sheet music, edit it, and do all of the major things that you'd want to do, which was considered to be pretty much unlikely, if not impossible, at the time.
Understandable. And something we were talking about before the call is how a lot of polymathic people end up being entrepreneurs and innovators. What do you think is the difference between those two, types of people?
Yeah, there's a little story that I think stuck in my mind along the way. It's not mine. I can't remember quite where it came from now, but it kind of illustrates it for me. I think the innovator is, if you like, the inventor, the guy that is, or girl, who's understands how the stuff works, but is interested enough to come up with a new idea and make it work. A whole range of things. It could be software, it could be hardware, it could be anything. But that's the innovator, or the innovator, of course, is broader than inventor. Innovator can be an innovator in business models or corporate structure or whatever. But so at core, I think an innovator is someone who thinks deeply, comes up with ideas, and stands them up to the point where they can be tested, if you like, and proven. And an entrepreneur is someone who takes an idea, a product, and is able to build a viable company around it. So the little story I was alluding to, if I can remember it correctly, is someone came up with a great idea. They were all working for, I'll say, Hewlett Packard, and it was someone like that. And he mentioned it to his friend Eric. I'll call Eric the entrepreneur. We'll call him. And Eric went, "Oh, that's a great idea. Well, tell you what, leave it with me." And he went and found, someone who's good at sales, and he went and found someone who could, design the casing for it, and said, "Okay, next Saturday round my house, I'll provide the tea and biscuits," and put the team together. And he's the entrepreneur. He's the one who, what did he do? Well, he took the idea and he kind of wrapped it around with the team. In many cases these days, and increasingly, and I think it's a good thing, the innovator or the inventor is able to be the entrepreneur, although there's a whole world of stories associated with that. Does that, shed any light?
I think it's good. It's interesting to think about the innovator and the entrepreneur. The innovator is almost really early on, whereas the entrepreneur is taking it that next step forward. And then you have more traditional businesses appear. If you look at the bell curve, the innovator is more bleeding edge, and then the entrepreneur is early stage.
Yeah, I think it's more of a continuum. That you've got. I mean, people do think of Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs as sort of archetypal, but very often you've got one person who is able to do both of those things, to kind of move between those, and there are real advantages to that sometimes it's a team, but yes, there's often a staging in it, yeah. And a drive derived from curiosity.
Are both affiliation towards the idea of polymathy. I want to ask you something I ask all my guests. What is a polymath to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably I'd say two things that may help to shed a little bit of light. The first is how I came to understand polymathy. Someone wrote to me, sort of out of the blue, and said, I've looked at your LinkedIn profile, Barry, and he didn't say what a load of horse shit, but he was a bit like that. He said, there's this and this. And in fact, in the last 24 hours, someone said, commented in a post saying it's non-linear. And unfortunately, that turns children. Many people have said, every single 5-year-old is a polymath, is a genius. And it takes those people and turns them into something else. And then I looked at my own profile and I went, oh. And he realized that his profile probably looked like that to other people. So that was funny. The point is, it crystallized for me that a lot of people just didn't, get it in. I don't fit, like other polymaths. That pattern doesn't fit with the expectation of a career progression, even if it kind of takes a turn here and there, So that started me looking for a way to reassure people, or at least explain to people simply that, this wasn't just a jigsaw put together from clippings or something, that, this was for real. And I couldn't find a word other than polymath, which came up when I researched, that would fit. And at that point, I said, well, I can't use the word polymath because someone will think I'm trying to be, a genius or Leonardo da Vinci or something, because that's what people think of when you think of polymath. And then, of course, I then discovered that there's a whole world of modern polymaths, of people now who, are they are a different norm, and we need that different norm for it to be understood. So we need to establish a new norm, but they don't fit the one size fits all. So that's how I came to this. My understanding of polymathy is increasingly this, that I now know a lot of polymaths. I've talked to a lot of polymaths, and there's a unifying theme, and that's curiosity. And I just think it's really almost as simple as this, but even worse, for most of the time, we're not even aware that we're doing it. So the fact that there is a human zoo, I think of humanity as a zoo. There are different sorts of animals who work and think and, almost eat in different ways, certainly mentally eat in different ways. The dopamine flows, and we want to do it again. So our reward for learning is intrinsic, whereas for most people, unfortunately, the school system teaches us that learning is a chore. Your interlocutor on that occasion couldn't imagine doing that, I suppose. Then, Dustin can't have either. And it's trivial, I suppose, relatively in that scenario, but it's the cause of so much misunderstanding. That's incredibly sad, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a couple points that I wanted to jump off there. For one, something you said, it was this idea of pushing past that plateau. And I think that's a big difference between like a jack of all trades, a generalist, and a polymath in that kind of scale, because the polymath has pushed past those plateaus more times than the other two have even tried, really. And it's interesting to think about that progression, learning past the hardship, like getting past those, okay, what are the barriers to me learning the subject? Those are the hard points that actually make you more of an expert in that field. And the other thing was, you're mentioning how like your LinkedIn profile was kind of scattered. It's not really scattered because it's who you are. You might have done pivots throughout your life, but from the perception of our societal norms of being a specialist, it looks scattered. It looks nonlinear. Nonlinear is not a negative thing, but from what that comment was saying, the way you explained it, that person almost seemingly made it seem like a negative thing. And I've definitely learned to ignore a lot of those more negative comments. I had someone tell me that I was very hyperbolic in the way I was talking, where I would say I've used all the social media management tools out there. And when that person said,
I think that Polymathy, for those who are engaged or so inclined, is a huge canvas, a huge release, particularly kind of stepping over that boundary and being able to kind of operate in a different way. Just a side note here, but possibly the biggest cause of misunderstandings, mistakes, and just bad thinking, I find, is that not only do people generally, us all, model whoever I'm talking to, whoever I'm interacting with on me, but we tend to revert to a kind of default, and some people just do this all the time, of assuming because I haven't or couldn't go and, try all of the social media tools out there. I think that another really important attribute of polymathy is this ability to, I think of it as use lots of different lenses, different paradigms, different ways of thinking, different points of view that enable a different set of information to be built with many from many is hugely important. And that's really hard for a team to do. It's really hard for, just bring a load of specialists together to do that. But I think my ambition for this,
in the 3D picture at that point.
Yeah.
It also might help to add, too, that I was pretty obsessed with finding the right tool. It wasn't a matter of like, oh, I'm curious. It was an obsession. I was like, I need to find the right tool. I need to find the right tool. Maybe to the point of almost detriment because it distracted me from other things. But yeah, that's a whole other tangent there.
Yeah.
And what do you think is the potential of polymathy?
Wow, it's a good question. If
Many
I ask
different ways you could take it.
On which level, you're going to say all of the above, aren't you, really?
Yeah, definitely will.
Let's start with on a personal level with polymaths led by polymaths, but also bringing polymathic minds together to purpose in a very deliberate and way that kind of plays to strengths and creates a kind of gestalt, a whole that didn't exist before. I think there's huge power in that.
I mean, it's a lot of the same philosophy why I have the show. We were talking about before the recording the idea of, to highlight polymathic people's lives on this show, for example, and try to bring people together through this medium.
Study of modern polymaths as opposed to polymathy as almost a magical, it was thought of as almost magical people who just kind of drop from the sky, Michelangelo or Da Vinci or whoever, we're superhuman in that incident with my LinkedIn profile was probably only a couple or maybe 3 years ago. Those things much better now than we could before. So I don't think it was magical. I think it's wonderful, but not necessarily magical. But now that we're beginning to understand it and beginning to understand ways in which we can not just recognize, but capitalize on polymathic people and their ability to do things that can't be done another way. There's lots of instances already where no matter how good a team, it cannot do what a polymath capable of integrating a range of different subjects and energies can do and keep track of. The ability to do overview. I believe that now we're beginning to understand the dynamics. We can start to bring together groups of polymaths and other people, perhaps, to tackle some of the real problems that we have, because someone else might see as, a huge obstacle and being asked to drink an ocean or something. Let's use a few simple metrics.
Yeah.
Let's use as few as possible. Let's drive everything on, GDP. If we get GDP right, everything else will fall into place. And this is with the results that we see. So But the world's a very complex place, and we need to grapple. And I would have described that at that point as new ways, not just to get the best out of supporting and facilitating teams. Yeah, it's great. Sufficiently different to be worthwhile. And for a very long time, I went on and, happy with that. And in that way, long story short, a few years ago, it became increasingly apparent that
So, a theme that I've seen on a variety of guests on the show who have been neurodivergent, and something that Perry Knoppert brought to my attention, and something you mentioned as well, is this idea of neurodivergence in polymathy. So certain sects of polymaths, or people who are neurodivergent, kind of fall into this polymathic lifestyle. Because
found a wonderful ADHD expert and coach, Janine Perryman, who is a leading expert in the UK here. And that was, the whole process of discovery was amazing. It was an epiphany, because I think it's probably instructive. And for probably 30 years now, I knew and recognized that my mind, my brain thinks in different ways to most of the people around me most of the time. I discovered this mostly through being an entrepreneur and working in businesses and working with people and being surprised by the way that they reacted to certain challenges and so on. And eventually came to understand that, what I would see as a juicy problem or a great, something to get my teeth into, because the two aren't the same. They're interrelated. We then realize I don't think you have to be diagnosably ADHD to be a polymath. It wasn't around.
Yeah.
And I eventually realized that I had a different learning style, as I would have said at that point. I don't generally, and it's still true, if I'm tackling a new area, I don't read the book. I don't want to read the book. I want to find out. I want to discover for myself. I want to create my own understanding, and then I'll read the book. And I'll probably critique the book as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether this is a rationalization or not. I still can't tell you, but I rationalized perhaps that gave me an advantage that, if I'd read the book, I'd see it the way the book saw it, and I would never be able to have my own point of view or opinion, and maybe I'd see things that were, and it turns out I in fact do have an ADHD brain, and I went and looked into that, and to understand, may not be that helpful, but there is an overlap, a parallel in profile and so on, and then too little being released into the brain in the truest sense of the word, but also there was a huge sense of loss accompanied with that, of all the many years of I can now drive this car differently, and I know how to do that. I know where the levers are now, but for all of those years, people looked at me strangely because I couldn't do what they could do. And now I can do what they can do, and I can do, loads of other stuff that they can't. So there was an element. So there's plenty of parallels. I believe there's a huge overlap. I discovered the whole thing of polymathy, and actually it was the same process over again. Another epiphany. It was based on the understanding on the day and on the symptoms. And I have no opinion of, whether you can, a particular individual can be a polymath without having ADHD. I certainly don't think you have to be recognizably or diagnosably ADHD. But I do know that when you look at the traits of ADHD from another and less medical point of view, well, what's the chief symptom? It's distractibility. It's the fact that when I'm reading something and I come across a concept or a word or an allusion to an idea, I want to follow that thread. And that happens a lot. all the time, and I'll quite often go off and research something I wasn't, that seems tangential. And that's polymathy in action. It's a form of polymathy in action, certainly. How do you acquire those different pieces of knowledge that allow you to make connections in a big picture? Well, that would be a great way to create the cauldron of connections that you need. So on the face of it, it seems to me that there's two different ways of looking at that, and yes, really extreme destructibility. That in other ways too. One way of describing people with ADHD, as it's kind of known to be related to dopamine, either or it being taken up too quickly, which dopamine being the thing that gives us impetus, drives us forward, and we replace that with kind of revving of the brain and novelty. That's how ADHD minds work. We're quote dopamine chasers, and if you kind of go back to what I was talking about earlier about the way that polymathic minds work, it's seeking novelty. It's we're dopamine chasers. If there's however you define the distinction, we both they both end up. Criteria and the diagnostic book for ADHD wasn't made by immortal gods who really understood, and therefore, and by the way, that we all anyway know there's such a thing as subclinical ADHD, i.e., it's not severe enough to trigger diagnosis. So put all those things together, and it's there's a very interesting crossover between those two and between entrepreneurialism as well.
I definitely want to point out too that it's not always a matter of causation or something like that. It's a matter of not every ADHD is going to be polymathic, but I think there's a lot of people who have ADHD who end up becoming polymathic by nature, and they don't seem to realize that as a way to describe themselves. It's not a matter of their neurodivergence, but a matter of just who they are. And that's why I brought it up too, because I think that like kind of how you have felt in your own experience, people who are ADHD, they might feel like it's a negative, when in actuality they could turn it into a positive through polymathy. And while I don't think that every person who's polymathic is ADHD, I think it's a matter of a certain subsect is. There is that interrelation there, like you say. I think it's a good way to highlight it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly some good TED Talks you can go and look at where people make a very good case for, flipping what was seen as a deficit in each person. And in some cases, ADHD is the obvious ingredient, and maybe there's no apparent autism or dyslexia or dyscalculia or any of the other things. In others, it's the other way around, and it can be a whole range. It's a cocktail. So I'm
glad you explained it like that.
Yeah, it does go to your identity. The other thing that is very, very clear in the experience of both polymaths and ADHD is other people they rarely fit in, and rarely completely anyway, and tend to be a little bit apart, and find it, find life a little bit difficult because of the expectations. There's an expectation, I think, of pretty much one size fits all, and neither ADHD thinking nor polymathic thinking a little bit apart, not fitting in. And I think that's an interesting aspect and really does go to identity. Yeah.
And before I get to the next question here too, I almost want to point out too, we're talking about neurodivergence from the point of view of ADHD and ADD, but I think there's also the idea of autism as well, because given the whole spectrum, there's certain people who are autistic who might also share a lot of common characteristics of polymaths. But the next question I have here is that you and I are both quite macro, big picture thinkers, and I like this question.
before we move on to the next question, can I just comment on that briefly?
Yeah.
And I want to tread carefully here because I know around the world, I know because I've spoken to some people, we kind of use different terminology and some of it has bad connotations in one territory and not in another and so on. So apologies to everyone if I'm not using what you would see as the right terminology. It's very clear to me that in neurodiversity, ADHD, autism or ASD or however, there's no dividing line. They are, they are diagnosed and are recognised on a set of symptoms, and they overlap. And it's my clear understanding that the actuality of this is but just to give you a flavour of what I mean by net intelligence, and I'm using that word because there really there isn't a word for the material, if you like, the three or more of them, and they come together in a cocktail. Hasn't, as far as I can tell, been studied anywhere near sufficiently, if at all, really, is, what are the forces at play that there are many. Are you familiar with the concept of the Overton window?
I'm not.
Okay, so the Overton window is something that's used in politics and media, I think. And it's the sort of range of thoughts, beliefs, ideas that is acceptable. And you kind of, once you get outside the Overton window, you're kind of in woo-woo land as far as the rest of the world is concerned. Whoa, you're talking, it's used in politics left and right, where's the end? Where does you get into the right grey area that you're in la la land and down from? But actually, it's true of ideas as well. That there's kind of lots of exploratory ideas which that you don't want to be zeitgeist public until you're secure in your understanding of them, until you've got evidence to back them up, until you can relate to other things. And then, in other ways, there's from the work on humane economics, for example, there's a huge project there to understand, not to just understand, but to work out how to fix our operating system so that we're able to see, in ways that are meaningful from a human point of view rather than just a financial point of view. That's where our operating system resides, and we need to fix it.
That might be a good topic for that episode too, because we barely, I think, scratched the surface with that. And I only really have one more question here before we end up wrapping up for today, but I'm definitely glad to have you back on because there's other things we didn't even get into, like crypto and stuff like that. But what do you have coming up that you're excited for?
So the thing I'm spending most of my time on at the moment is related to humane energy survey. We surveyed renewable energy technologies around the world and their uses to kind of work out where we stand as a system, I suppose, that I'm talking about. The nearest word is zeitgeist. So most people would recognize zeitgeist, know what it is. It's the spirit of the age. It's like in the 60s, we thought in this way. In the 70s, we thought in that way. In the 80s, we thought in that way. Like a series of snapshots. What animate that movie? Because it is a movie. As a zeitgeist is a photograph. It's a still.
Interesting.
But that movement from one to the other is and it's not collective consciousness, which is a tempting term to apply, but it's not because it's not conscious, and it's not collective unconscious either. I don't believe anyway, because there's things that people are doing, there's things that institutions are doing, so it turns out when you kind of map this out and look at it, that there's, if you kind of look at the different levels, 2000 campaign, who said every street should be a power station. They said, right, well, let's make our streets a power station. They crowdfunded for that. And inspired by that, I went to our street here, literally the street where I live, and said, should we do this? And they said, great, but we don't want to do crowdfunding. And why not? Well, we can pay for this ourselves. Really? Okay. And of politics, in which there's a flux, if you like. I suppose you might call it almost a kind of mental ether in the old sense of the physical ether, which we haven't done sufficient to understand. I think it's really important because when we did the humane energy, we are in pilot right now. We've got a model that will prove through our pilot for a high percentage of people, a high percentage of homes will be able to pay for itself. And by pay for itself, I don't mean 10 years or 5 years or 7 years down the track. I mean from day one. I mean to work out when they will become economic for ordinary folk. And we did this about 2 years ago. Completed it about 2 years ago. Fascinating, different technologies in use in different places. We've got big plans to, in China, we don't do it here. I don't think it's done much in the USA either. And there's some developments coming down the track on that are really interesting. But it wasn't easy. And this was per se, how do we apply this? How do we adapt this here? To which I'm saying, look, I'm fielding inquiries from the next street and the next one. I'm telling them at the moment, wait till our pilot's done. Do you know what? I'm not ready for the next country at the moment.
Give us a moment, please.
Yeah. So, but it's really exciting. The level of interest in this from day one has been, in my experience, unprecedented. The last 10, 12 years. They ran a crowdfund to put solar on roofs in their street, inspired by global economist Ann Pettifer, who is famous for the Jubilee. And this is a genuine opportunity, not just for a government or a region to escape that, but actually for a household to escape that and for the needs for energy to become independent of all of that. And actually more than that, with the next phases that we're working on, for this to become a source of income. But will help another street. And that kind of set me a challenge. We needed a new model. Yeah. And when I sat down to create that new model, I said, what should it look like? And I said, well, it should be something that allows this technology that already exists and has become mature and whose costs are falling and continue to fall. It should allow it to proliferate. So how can we, I added to the challenge, like you do, how do we create a model, that enables renewable technology, in this case, starting with solar and batteries, to proliferate? You can hook in that way as well.
That's awesome. I'll have links in the description for you, and thank you for coming on here.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Dustin. I look forward to doing it again sometime.
I look forward to it too. This is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Barry James on the Polymath Podcast. Thanks for being here, guys.
The loan that you presumably will take out to pay for it, it will produce enough income and savings together, because it'll produce both income and savings to pay for the loan and give you a surplus. So we'll have data on that shortly, create hubs, Green Streets hubs right across the UK. We're already talking to some people. We've already been approached by some other territories. And I think it's for this, and this is the heartbeat of what we discovered. I mentioned earlier that we have become entrapped by global markets who are able to tax us at will, basically. Our governments can't stop them. They're not in charge of the sunlight. They're not in charge of the wind. And this is, it's difficult to think of anything else that has that level of that kind, or indeed any independence of the global economic system. This does.
I think that's really interesting there, and I'm hoping that we can see more results from that when you said the data comes out, and hopefully maybe spread it to the US too, so definitely need it here. But If people are interested in finding you, where can people find you online, Barry?
Yeah, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm Barry E. James on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find there. If you can't find me there, barryejames.com will find me, and you'll find the other spaces from there. And actually, if you go to greenstreaks.club, you can hook in that way as well.
That's awesome. I'll have links in the description for you, and thank you for coming on here.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Dustin. I look forward to doing it again sometime.
I look forward to it too. This is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Barry James on the Polymath Podcast. Thanks for being here, guys.